Okay, namaste everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. As you know, this is our Charcha Chat episode with Professor Subhash Kak on the abrogation of Article 370 relating to Jammu and Kashmir. So Professor Subhash Kak is somebody who needs no introduction, but I'll provide a brief one anyway. Professor Subhash Kak is the Regents Professor of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering at the Oklahoma State University. And he was recently conferred with the Padma Shri Award, which is one of the highest civilian honors that the Indian government confers. So he's an incredibly brilliant and thoughtful person. And I've had the opportunity to interact with him on the history of Jammu and Kashmir last summer. And he provides incredible insights into these issues. So Professor Kak, thank you so much for joining us here on HSC's Charcha Chat.
Thank you, Parth. I'm really excited to be here conversing with you. And let's see where the conversation goes.
Great. So to start by foregrounding the conversation on Article 370, a lot of our students, they're exposed to the media narrative about Jammu and Kashmir, which often portrays it as having become a part of India through a mistake or a coincidence of history, rather than being an integral part of India's history itself. Can you provide some perspective as to how Kashmir has been an integral part of India and what role it's played in its cultural, intellectual development?
Well, there are two aspects to this question. First is the political aspect. The Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir acceded to India in 1947, which means he signed the instrument of accession, which is law or international law. So certainly Kashmir is an integral part of India, but subsequent to that, a constituent assembly was called in Kashmir. And in 1954, the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly were incorporated into certain conditions in the Indian Constitution, which came to be called Article 370 and Article 355A, which have their own history, and I'll come to that history shortly. But that apart, Kashmir has truly been one of the most central places as far as Indian culture and civilization is concerned. Some of the greatest minds in literature, in art, in grammar, in medicine, in philosophy belong to Kashmir. And people from all over the country have looked at Kashmir as truly a place of great learning. And in fact, Al-Biruni, who accompanied Mahmud of Ghaznavi in his attacks to India in the 1130s, I believe, mentioned that as far as he knew, the two centers in North India were Banaras and Kashmir, and to both of those places, Al-Biruni, who was accompanying Mahmud of Ghazni, was not able to go, and he regretted that he therefore was not able to find the most authentic understanding of the Indian civilization. But in spite of that, of course, his book on India called Al-Hind is a remarkable book. You lost the volume.
Yes, so my apologies. So you mentioned a few different areas in which Kashmir had a particularly important role. One of them was, you were talking about aesthetics. So can you just build upon that a little bit? Who were the aestheticians in Kashmir, and what was their role for the rest of Indian culture?
Well, there were across India many philosophers who looked at aesthetics from different perspectives, such as cleverness, or in poetry, how do you build different structures, metaphors, this and that. But two philosophers who arose in Kashmir, Anandavardhan and Abhinav Gupta after him, argued that the role of aesthetics is to communicate something transcendental or something much deeper through a process of resonance, artistic resonance, which in Sanskrit is called dhvani. And so they came up with this theory of dhvani, which is an amazing amazing sophisticated theory that the premise behind which is that if the artist is trying to teach down to the student or the viewer, then possibly there's going to be a pushback. But if the artist or the teacher is able to use suggestion, because every human being does want to get connected to something deeper, something which connects that person to transcendental, it would be much more effective doing so. And this theory of dhvani has played a central role in Indian aesthetics, and this theory is also spread far and wide into other nations after Western scholars started studying it.
Right. And a couple of other things that you had also mentioned was that Kashmir was a center of learning, just like Banaras was. And one of the greatest centers of learning was Sharda Peeth. And you'd also mentioned to me in particular, I think the last time that we met, that the very famous Bakshali manuscript is also written in the Sharda script of Jammu and Kashmir. So can you just speak to the science that was developed in Kashmir as well?
Sharda Peeth and not far from it, the Takshashila University. So there was this center. Sharda Peeth is, of course, the religious center, but Takshashila was a broader center of learning, not very far from it. All kinds of things which made Indian sciences the greatest until the European Renaissance in the 17th century, because we do have the statement of Said al-Andalusi of Spain in the 11th century, writing his book on sciences of all the nations, that the nation which was first amongst all as far as sciences are concerned was India. And he does also describe what he knew, which one would imagine the medieval scholars knew about the world, about the ancient world, that India was the foremost. And certainly Kashmir played a central role, as did other parts of India, because I think it'll be wrong to suggest that it was exclusively done in Takshashila, because there were several other centers, both formal universities as well as informal centers spread all across the country, as we do know, with great astronomers and mathematicians and people who wrote on combinatorics, and of course the tradition of Arthashastra, people who wrote on musicology. And in musicology itself, you have Bharata, who did his Natya Shastra, which has many sections on musicology. Then we have many others. And then we have Sangeet Ratnakar of Shangradeva, who was a Kashmiri, who then emigrated to South India. And his book is a great classic of music. And in fact, it tells us how music in India, both in the North and South, was the same until about the 12th century. And then there was a certain divergence that took place for a variety of reasons.
Okay, excellent. One of our viewers would like to know, just sort of in terms of the timeline, when some of these developments happened, for context. So these philosophers, Abhinavgupta and Anandavardhana, when were they sort of active, and when were these scientific developments in Takshashila happening?
Well, many people claim that Takshashila University goes back into centuries BC. And then the great manual of art in India, the Vishnu Dharmottar Puran, is sometimes dated to about the 3rd or the 4th century CE. And then you have Charaka Samhita, which the latest version, of course, it was revised at many different places, goes to Kashmir. Then Anandavardhan, I believe, is 9th century. and Abhinav Gupta is 10th or 11th century.
Okay, great. So one of the aspects that we haven't even covered yet is the religious aspect. Kashmiri Shaivism is one of the greatest, I guess, exports in terms of philosophy and theology that has come from Kashmir. In fact, every year HSC's annual camp is at a Kashmiri Shaivite ashram here in New York State. So can you just briefly provide an overview of the role that Kashmiri Shaivism has played in shaping Advaita Vedanta teachings around India?
Parth, you're right. Kashmiri Shaivism is Advaitic Vedanta, but it's Vedanta with a slightly different twist. That unlike classical Vedanta, it emphasizes the manifested world itself as an expression of divinity. Therefore, in the Kashmir Shaivite tradition, there was more of an emphasis on interacting with the world, not renunciation, which was valued quite a bit in the Vedantic tradition in the South, for example. While in Kashmir Shaivism, perhaps more in continuation with what we find in the Vedic period with the rishis who were all householders. So Kashmiri Shaivite masters were householders because they said you don't have to move away from the lived life to understand the deepest intuitions related to this reality. So, so now what has made Kashmir Shaivism so much of an important system in our current times is because it calls consciousness, one's own consciousness, as the very embodiment of Ishvara, of Godhead, if you use that loaded word. And therefore, what it says is that, look, everybody is potentially in a position to look within. Everybody, irrespective of where they come from, what they are, everybody is equal, first of all. So it's a universal philosophical system and system of spirituality that you look within, and that consciousness is what is called Shiva. So you connect up to the Shiva within you, and once you do so, then of course there are very, very subtle ideas involved, which have parallels also in modern philosophy and especially interpretations of quantum mechanics, which tell you how, even though you are body and therefore governed by biological and physical laws, still you're also consciousness, and still you're able to interact with your body and change, first of all, who you are, and also get absolutely, uncommon understanding of the world.
This is so incredible. This is what I was saying at the very beginning, was when I was talking about how there's insights that only you can provide, being an expert both of quantum mechanics as well as hailing yourself from Kashmir. So what comes across from your I guess from this dialogue so far is that Kashmir had a very vibrant intellectual and cultural history. It was deeply interwoven with the rest of India's developments. And so I just wanted to briefly mention that this Article 370 has been another occasion for people to learn a little bit more about the history of Hindu society and Hindus in Kashmir. So the Hindus that hail from Kashmir are called Kashmiri Pandits, is that right?
Right. A couple of other things about Kashmir which are not very well known. Kashmiri scholars, in particular Kumarajit, for example, I think in the 4th century, played a central role in taking Indian ideas to China, and translations of work, not literally of, let's say, Buddhist texts, not literally, in a form that made them unique, which a lot of scholars believe created the classical culture and civilization of China as we know it. So incredible influence that many Kashmiri scholars had over China and through China over Japan as well. For example, as we know, Dhyana of yoga became Chan in China and became Zen in Japan. Now, the geographical area north of Kashmir, which is the Tarim Basin, which is in Xinjiang, was also Buddhist, and not just Buddhist, it also was Shaivite, because a lot of Shiva statues and texts have been found there. And people had Sanskrit names, they spoke Sanskritic or Indic languages. It was one of the great centers also of learning, tremendous interaction with Kashmir, until it fell to invaders in 1016 CE, and that's when it became Islamic. But then what they were able to do, as it was in the process of being overrun, they were able to take the texts and hide them in caves in Dunhuang, and these caves were opened about 120 years ago. So a huge amount of information has been discovered, and this information is not very widely known. It's not very widely known that how much of influence Kashmir had over China and Central Asia and possibly beyond through that region. Now, this is one point. The other point is diversity in Jammu and Kashmir. Jammu and Kashmir is literally a microcosm of India. It's often represented in newspaper columns as this binary of Muslims versus Hindus of Jammu versus Muslims of Kashmir. But that doesn't really do justice to what the facts are. First of all, there is tremendous diversity in Kashmir itself. There are other groups like the Shias, who are about 15-20%, who do not necessarily see eye to eye with the Sunni majorities. And then, of course, you had the Kashmiri Pandits, who were exiled or forced out or ethnically cleansed in 1990. And my family, for example, is a very ancient family, which goes back at least several hundred years, because in Rajya Tarangani itself, which is 1030, I believe, there is a mention of a Tilak Kak, who happened to be a general, although sadly on the losing side of the war. So there's a lot of, we have very old roots, and we know the geography. It's all described in such intimate details in this Kalhan's Raj Tarangani. But Jammu and Kashmir has tremendous diversity, and Jammu itself has many different languages. And as somebody who grew up in small towns in Jammu, several towns in Jammu, several small towns in Kashmir, and also 2 years in Ladakh, I had to learn many different languages, in the school and elsewhere in the bazaars. And to give you a background to the complexity of Article 370, in 1846, the Sikhs lost to the English in, I believe, the second or the third Anglo-Sikh War. And one of the conditions of the treaty was that the Sikhs would sell the province of Kashmir to the Jammu king for 75 lakhs of rupees. And so Kashmir until then had been ruled by the Sikhs for about 40-50 years. And then it became part of Jammu. And subsequent to that, because the Maharaja had to raise funds to pay the English, he brought in some administrators from outside. And then there was a reaction, and it set into process a chain where the years 1889, 1911, and 1927 are important, where certain rules were framed to define who is a state subject. And in fact, this is one of the central things of Article 370. So at the very last revision of that in 1927 stated that everybody who had lived continuously in Kashmir for Jammu and Kashmir, for 10 years would be a state subject. And the year that was counted was 1927. And when Article 370 was added to the Constitution, this was maintained. And therefore, the hundreds of thousands of refugees from across the border who were related to people on this side of the border, for example, in Jammu, the cities of Jammu and Sialkot are not very far from each other. So they were disenfranchised by Article 370 because there was no way they were given rights to either participation in elections or holding of immovable property in Jammu and Kashmir state. Now, in normal polity, there's always injustices. Well, let's not call it injustices. There are push and pull because there are things which change, and therefore a normal polity is able to adjust. But Kashmir's polity after 1954 remained frozen in ways which was unacceptable. For example, the number of individuals who formed a legislative constituency in the Jammu province was, I think, 20 or 30% larger than in Kashmir. It's all right, maybe that's what the case was in 1954. There should have been a system of delimitation. And the Kashmiri legislature failed the J&K state by holding on to an arrangement which had become defunct by appealing to emotionalism. And this was emotionalism related to this religious binary. And then because either non-residents who were actually living in Jammu and Kashmir state for generations, either they or outside businesses could not buy property. If you cannot buy property, why would you want to invest? And because the political leaders in Kashmir would stoke these passions because they held on to power and they wanted to hold on to power. As Lord Acton said, power leads to corruption and untrammeled power, absolute power leads to absolute corruption. Right. So that's what happened in J&K state. So normally, if you had an arrangement like this where the legislature was continually able to respond to the needs of its citizenry, this wouldn't have become an issue. But it has been exploited, perhaps rightly so as claimed by people in Delhi, by just a few families, so that they became the middle persons between the outsiders who wanted to invest and the ones who had within them their power to grant licenses within J&K state. But it was a system which could not last because it's like a feudal system. Let's imagine the United States, where people who came in 100 years ago still don't have rights to vote. And clearly, no liberal polity or liberal individuals would put up with that. But somehow, the seizing of the discourse, of the narrative by groups who had vested interest and their allies in Delhi sometimes, so that people who read English newspapers don't always get all these nuances. It's a very complicated thing. If it's a multipolar set of communities, ethnically diverse, linguistically diverse, and having lived in Ladakh also for 2 years as a middle school child, I know how different Ladakh was and how the Ladakhis also felt disenfranchised. And therefore, something needed to be done. And personally, I think it's a positive thing that what has happened. And it's also positive because, after all, what everybody wants is that everyone in J&K state should prosper, but then you need mechanisms for that prosperity to occur. And if and when the residents of Kashmir Valley discover that indeed this is something which is for their good, not only would it help them feel that sense of belonging, it would perhaps also an exemplar of how disenfranchised, not disenfranchised, people who feel that they're disenfranchised, rest of the country would feel that the way to go is to participate politically. The powers that be in Delhi or elsewhere are dedicated and devoted to everybody's progress. And truly, I do believe in that. And I think this change in the arrangement should make that possibility so much easier to attain.
So there was a lot in your answer there. So I just want to briefly pause to unpack a lot of it. So you were mentioning the Article 370 sort of insulate and also Article 35A insulated Jammu and Kashmir from the rest of India because it didn't allow central provisions in law to be applicable to the state except in cases of defense. Is that?
Well, what happened after the 1960s was that most or many of the articles or the details of Article 370 had been whittled away anyway. But I think the most serious ones were the fact that businesses or individuals could not invest in property. And now, of course, much has been made also of how many of the central provisions have not been adopted by J&K state. But I don't think that's as central because sooner or later, the legislature did have the freedom to do so. And clearly they were not always a part of the arrangement in Delhi as well until say 10, 15 years ago. So I think the most important thing was, the two most important things were the delimitation of the constituencies, because it was an unfair arrangement. The Jammu residents felt disenfranchised, and very rightly so, because the facts stated that they had to be a much larger constituency for one assembly seat. And then you had all the other refugees who had come into Jammu from across the border in Pakistan, Pahadis and others, who were ethnically and linguistically the same as the Jammu people, but they had been left out. And this is so totally unfair. While I think Mr. Nehru had made special arrangements for some people who had been living in Kashmir for 2 or 3 generations, some people from Central Asia, to be given Kashmiri citizenship. So there were a lot of these loose threads which had not been sorted out. And if one looks at it pragmatically and not from a political angle, from a pragmatic perspective, the most serious element was the fact that businesses and individuals could not own property, and that the whole arrangement was frozen in time into the 50s. So that could not certainly last for too long.
Right. So one aspect is economic development, and the other aspect is lack of civil rights for people who have been living in the region for since independence, basically.
Absolutely.
So on the second issue, you mentioned the people who were refugees from Pakistan who came over. One of the other communities that has gotten some attention in this issue is the Valmiki community. So can you speak to their experience and why their experience has been particularly central to the debate around Article 370?
From what I know of that question, I believe in 1957, maybe several tens of thousands of people from outside of Jammu and Kashmir were brought in for the most menial of tasks, like scavenging and so on. And in Jammu and Kashmir, and as a Jammu and Kashmiri resident myself, for admission to schools and colleges, for jobs, you needed a state subject certificate. Now, these people who have been living on since 57 had no jobs open to them excepting that of manual scavengers. If their children did well at school, or they were aspirational as every human being should be, because they did not have the state subject, because they were marginalized, probably, one could say something similar to what happened in what existed in the United States during the slavery system, or even after 1864, after slavery was abolished formally, until the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, the African Americans did not truly have equal rights. I mean, they couldn't hold certain jobs, although legally that wasn't the case. But in Jammu and Kashmir, it was a legal thing that these people, since they did not have the state subject certificate, they could not get jobs which are open to everybody else. I think it was the most unfair system, which was abhorrent, and nothing had been done. The assembly had not responded to it, and that's because they were just frozen into the 50s, quite happy with the advantages that they had or perks of office.
Right. So just based on off this last piece of the puzzle, was the discrimination that was happening on the basis of Article 370 as much about religion as it was about class? In other words, was it really about elites who were in power trying to create a political system in which they would preserve their power for as long as possible by disenfranchising those either at the bottom of the social hierarchy or those who are less inclined to support them?
I think it was a mixture of the two, because many of the workers or summer workers, laborers who did the farm stuff, because Kashmir has also become quite prosperous compared to the 1950s, where many of them were Muslims, let's say from Bihar or elsewhere. But I think it had become a system where those who were in the bus, so to speak, did not want anybody else, irrespective of religion or ethnicity, to get in. And therefore, people who were not in were left out. And the only way some of them could get in was if they married into a Kashmiri family. And 35A still discriminated there, because there were some Kashmiri women who married non-Kashmiri men, and then they lost their state subject rights. While if a Kashmiri man married a non-Kashmiri woman, they would still retain it. That was the 35A rule. So it was a complicated system. It was a system where somehow the guys who were in wanted to perpetuate their advantages, their benefits. They were probably not talking about it necessarily in terms of this is how we are doing it. It's sometimes people or a class or even a country can become blinded to all the details that exist. You don't even see what the problems are. I think that's what it was, a failure not only of the political class, but also of the journalistic class, of writers, of everybody, because these are issues of basic fairness should have been brought up in a very bold way. And a mirror should have been held to the elites of Jammu and Kashmir state. And they ought to have been told that, look, this is not fair. You need to change. And if they had changed themselves, if the assembly had done things, then probably there wouldn't have been all these strains. Jammu and Kashmir would have progressed much more rapidly, economically, and therefore there wouldn't have been any issues at all. But because the assembly failed, the elites failed, it was sick in some sense. So something drastic needed to be done. And I believe Narendra Modi did something very drastic. He needs to be praised for it, because doing drastic in political situations is not always the easiest of steps. But I think all this was forced on him. And I look at it in a very positive sense. I think there is a lot of potential for the state and Kashmir in particular to really build upon its natural strengths of, first of all, tourism, of its amazing tradition of learning. They could set up colleges and universities, just as you go to Uttaranchal, you go to Dehradun and Mussoorie, you see these elite high schools and middle schools where on my last visit 3 years ago, I found students from all across the world, even American students who are studying in high schools, and there are many high schools in Mussoorie, in the hills of Mussoorie. Kashmir also has even greater advantages of natural beauty. This is one of the things they could focus on, education, both at the school level and the college and university level. They could focus on healthcare. They could set up great hospitals. So Kashmir could once again become a great destination for visiting, for learning, and for people to improve their health, should that be needed.
Yeah. So if I understand your answer correctly, basically this was a move that was, like you said, forced upon Narendra Modi because it was an issue that was, I mean, Article 370 was supposed to be temporary as a sort of transitional measure, but it became permanent. And this led to these types of systemic inequalities that needed to be corrected. So this was done sort of by, I don't want to say executive fiat, but one of the criticisms has been that it was done in a way that was not completely democratic. In fact, that's been almost the exclusive focus of the international media. They haven't even covered the underlying issues with Article 370, really. So what do you think of that type of perspective? Do you think it was realistic that these inequities could have been solved through deliberation and dialogue with the political class in Kashmir?
Well, the questions of the inequities has been debated for 70 years now. The people in Jammu are saying that why can't you delimit the constituencies? And nothing has been done. So the political class in Jammu and Kashmir have become deaf. Just imagine, let's say there's a person who's ill and the person refuses to take medication. Then what do? At some point, you have to do something drastic. I think this is one of those cases. I'm quite sure that Mr. Modi and his advisors didn't want to do it. And just imagine they had a alliance with PDP, Mehbooba Mufti's party, for 3 years. And I think if I were to speak briefly on Narendra Modi's style, he does give total freedom of action to his ministers and to alliance partners. So I guess they waited for 3 years. They were hoping that Mrs. Mufti would do what is the right thing, and doing so would also strengthen her politically. But I think the players in Jammu and Kashmir were also prisoners to the whole process. Sometimes you feel that you can't do it because of the emotionalism, which is so rampant in the politics of that state. Even if Umar Abdullah wanted to change, because in many ways Umar Abdullah was quite a modern chief minister. He was prior to Mehbooba Mufti, but he was not able to do anything. None of the initiatives that were required were even brought to the table. So a modern looking person comes to the government, comes to power, and then does nothing. And then Mehbooba Mufti in alliance with BJP, and I think BJP gave her free rein, and something had to be done. And something had to be done today or tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Isn't it good that it's done today rather than wait again and let all these problems fester further?
No, absolutely. And what you're describing sort of reminds me of the way in which when southern states failed to secure the civil rights of African Americans, whether it was in the education system through segregation, or whether it was through polling tests that effectively blocked their franchise, the federal government stepped in. They passed the Voting Rights Act. They enforced Brown versus Board of Education by desegregating the schools essentially by using military force. So this is something that has been historically ingrained not only in other parts of the world, but also in our own country. And it's striking to see the way in which the international media has basically not covered this aspect at all. Can you speak just a little bit about sort of why this is the case, and in particular, why the Hindu perspective, or the perspective of the people who have been disenfranchised, particularly in Jammu and Ladakh, has not been part of the conversation about Kashmir at all, not only for this particular incident, but also more broadly?
I agree. I'm quite shocked because there are some smart people who write editorials for newspapers in Delhi and elsewhere in New York and London. Why don't they know all of this? And it's not a religious perspective that we are talking here. We are talking in general terms. We are talking in terms of equity. It's not just Jammu and Ladakh. Workers or laborers from the rest of India, and many of them are Muslims also, or even Rohingya. There are 40,000 Rohingya who have slipped into Jammu and Kashmir state in the last 5-10 years. They are all denied state subject certificates, right? Of course, Rohingyas is a much more complicated question because they are illegal immigrants. But let's say immigrants into or workers into Kashmir Valley itself from rest of India who may be Muslim, they have also been denied state subject certificates. So they can only work as day workers or daily wage workers in the farm or in factories. And some of them could have been living there for 70 years. And that's so totally unfair. I personally don't understand why these journalists, these editorial writers have taken care to determine all these complications associated with the Jammu and Kashmir situation, and the questions not of religion polarity, but or religious polarity or religious binary, but questions of fundamental fairness and civil liberties, which were at stake in the old arrangement of J&K state.
Sure. So can you speak a little bit? So one of the other regions that's gotten a lot of attention because of a very articulate speech in the Lok Sabha has been Ladakh. You mentioned that you lived in Ladakh for 2 years. What were the specific kinds of ways in which the Ladakhis in particular felt that they were being discriminated against?
Well, Ladakhis were, okay, let me step back. What happened in Jammu and Kashmir, first of all, is also related to what was happening in all of India. After the British came, according to comparative economists, and you are one, and you certainly would know that, it's believed that late 1700s, India's share of the world economy was about 25 to 30%. By the time the English left, it had dropped to 3 or 4%. So the 19th century was truly a horrific time for India, where many communities became impoverished. And because of that, jobs disappeared. And so when Jammu and Kashmir state was formed in the 1850s and later on, the only jobs that for a long time were to be had, because the crafts were affected, everything else was affected, were the governmental sector. And so what J&K state did was to create this whole quota regime where, for example, all the openings that opened up in any specific departments in Srinagar, there were, say, 6 or 7 for Kashmiri Muslims, 2 or 3 for people from Jammu, and then maybe 1 left for a Kashmiri Pandit. And the poor Ladakhis were totally screwed. And so again and again, they felt that they were not getting their due share, because you can't always also talk in terms of absolute numbers. It's a very complicated, once you have a complicated geography, you have to have a means of, first of all, general development across all those regions. And clearly that was not happening in Ladakh. And this quota regime is another factor which made Kashmiri Hindus, for example, leave. What the most astonishing thing that would come as a surprise to most of your listeners is that the political arrangement of the 1950s, they declared that every Kashmiri, Jammu and Kashmir resident was backward, excepting the Kashmiri Pandits or Kashmiri Hindus. So 9 out of 10 jobs, not only at the entry level, but at every promotional level, were reserved by this arrangement. And the positions that were reserved for the Muslims, let's say 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10, those positions were, let's say, engineering positions in the Jammu and Kashmir Public Works Department or Electricity Department. They were used up because all the Kashmiri Muslims were put in one class, while Kashmiri Muslim Muslims themselves are stratified. There are progressives, there are the upper middle class, and then there are the poorer sections. The poorer sections did not get those jobs at all. So this was as if the creamy layer, the most prosperous Kashmiri Muslims hogged all the jobs, or a vast majority of jobs in the J&K state. And not only were the Kashmiri Pandits shafted or the Jammuites shafted, but Kashmiri Muslims themselves, vast majority of them were shafted, as were the Ladakhis. So it was a totally, if I were to use an extreme term, it was a sick system. It could not go on forever.
Right. So I wanted to just briefly turn our attention to the way in which Kashmiri Pandits were basically cleansed from the valley. You yourself are a Kashmiri Pandit, and you've spoken about your perspective a lot. One of the arguments that has been made has also been that Article 370 paved the way for the Kashmiri Pandits to be cleansed from the valley in this genocide. So can you sort of expound on why that was the case, and do you feel that this is an accurate description of sort of the political process or the social process that led to your community being discriminated against and being forced to flee your homes?
Well, I wouldn't exactly put it that way, that Article 370 did it, because Kashmiris were still living on. They may have been discriminated against, but they managed one way or the other. What made their position untenable was that in 1990, the general Kashmiri Muslim population, now I shouldn't say Kashmiri general Muslim population, let's say 15-20% of the extremists who seized the political theater or political narrative, so to speak, in Kashmir, declared that Kashmiri Hindus must leave. And in the more extreme of their pronouncements from mosques and other places, they said, well, they could leave their women behind, but otherwise they should leave. And there were a lot of murders, several hundred Kashmiri Hindus, and they were a small minority, just a couple of 100,000 people out of a total of 3 million. And they were all, they were peace-loving people. They were school teachers. They taught everybody. They were teaching Muslims. They were teaching Hindus. They were into education. They were into businesses as well. They were into farming as well. But their position became untenable because of security concerns. And these security concerns really perhaps did not arise due to a ferment which was truly local. It was being pushed by the Pakistanis through their ISI. And what had happened, as you know, in the 1980s, there was ISI pushing the Khalistanis to do their insurgency in Pakistan. Afghanistan had fallen. They thought that maybe Kashmir could also be snatched away from India. So they used the strategy of targeted killings. They wanted the Kashmiri Hindus to be pushed out. And that's what they were able to do. So I would say not Article 370 directly. Article 370 made it difficult for a lot of youth to stay on. For example, when I did my engineering, I didn't even think about staying on in J&K State. I went out to Delhi and then I came over to the US. And many other people also did that. And that's because there were more opportunities outside. Because, okay, the governmental sector in no country can satisfy the job aspirations of everybody. So maybe Article 370 from that perspective, as far as Kashmiri Pandits were concerned, was not the deciding factor. These were the political events of 1990, behind which it's generally acknowledged was Pakistan as the actor, which was orchestrating that whole period of violence. And then it continued in the 1990s also. There were many massacres where entire families, 20s, 30s, 40s were wiped out, were killed. So it continued until there was a lot of pressure. Maybe there was not that much of that going on right now, targeted killing of Kashmiri Hindus. But it is a part of that process, certainly. And the very fact that Jammu and Kashmir state had not progressed to the extent it needed to progress was an element.
Right. That's an important point. As a Kashmiri Pandit, how do you feel about the way that your community's narrative has been portrayed in, in, in relation to the conflict that exists in Jammu and Kashmir?
I think the Kashmiri Pandits, Kashmiri Hindus have been sort of ignored completely. Nobody's talking about them. There are still many of them in camps in Jammu, and the rest of them have moved on and done, they may have lost all their property of generations and their connection to their land in Kashmir Valley, but they moved on in Jammu, in rest of India. Some have emigrated to New Zealand and Australia and the United States and Europe. And so in terms of numbers, they're probably not a very important element at all. So I'm addressing whatever remarks I'm making about the future of Kashmir. I'm speaking not as one where Kashmiri Hindus are going to be an important part of the story. Now, it's possible that a few of them, maybe 500 or 1,000, may go back if the economy improves. But just as a lot of Kashmiri Hindus left the valley in the 1700s, and you have the Nehru family, for example, which left at that time, or even prior to that, you have the Saraswats in South India, in Karnataka, in Goa, in Maharashtra, who left Kashmir much prior to that, when things were uncertain there in the 1100s and 1200s, and they have become a part of the communities and provinces where they have resided for all these years. So the same thing is happening, but we must also acknowledge that the world has changed, not just for Kashmiris, but for everybody else. In many ways, this is the world as a global village, and people are moving in great numbers across boundaries. And Kashmiri Hindus, as well as Kashmiri Muslims, many Kashmiri Muslims are also working all across India or in other countries. So we are all in it as equals. I think the best we can do and should want to do is to make Jammu and Kashmir a great place for economic development for everybody. I think the fears that some are talking about of demographic change, etc., is all ridiculous. There's not going to be any demographic change. People don't go to a place just because somebody's ideology says go to this place. People go to a place where there are jobs, where people feel welcome. So I don't think Kashmiri Pandits themselves will go in large numbers, maybe just a handful of people who are a part of education community, teachers, school teachers, and so on. So Kashmir demographically will remain about the same as now. But what I do fervently hope that in the new arrangement, the economic conditions would be such so that Kashmiris of all hues and backgrounds, and Kashmiri Muslims certainly, would be able to take advantage of the increased economic opportunities of investments into education, into tourism, into heritage tourism. Kashmir has an amazing history. Why not take advantage of that? Just look at Bihar. Bodh Gaya has become a great center for tourism from East Asia, because this is the place where the Buddha attained nirvana and enlightenment. So Kashmir can also be a great center, not just for Indians, but even for Chinese. Look, a lot of what China is because of those Kashmiri scholars. Kashmiris themselves do not know about it. And let's embrace history, everybody. We are not talking about religion at all. We are talking about common humanity and possibilities for everybody. Let everybody be able to achieve what they can be. And I think in this new arrangement, it's more likely for that to happen than was the case in the previous arrangement, which was frozen in so many different ways politically, and it had become completely impossible for it to attend to all the challenges which every state must address from time to time.
Absolutely. I really love the way you put that. I know that you're not very optimistic, or you don't think that many Kashmiri Pandits will resettle in the valley. Do you feel that the renewed interest in Kashmir and more Indian people, tourists from other countries coming to Kashmir, will help unearth its contributions to the philosophy, the science that we were discussing at the beginning. Do you think this will help reintegrate these traditions into the mainstream of Indian thought and perhaps rekindle a sort of Kashmiri renaissance?
I think so. I'm very optimistic. I'm optimistic both philosophically, because these are universal ideas. When we are talking about consciousness, there is the frontier of science. That's the frontier of physics and neuroscience and health sciences and computer science. Everybody is wondering, what is consciousness? Where does it come from? And Kashmir was that center where some of the deepest work on this question was done, scientifically and philosophically. And also all the great achievements and contributions that it made in aesthetics, in music, in other performance arts. So why shouldn't that come back in? And we are not talking about religion here at all. It's like, you go to Java, you go to different Yogyakarta or Jogja, as it's called. You find people who are Muslims, but they are connected to the arts of their part of the world in a very fundamental way. I was very, very impressed last time I was in Java to see the wonderful level of the arts and people's commitment to it. And so why can't that happen in Kashmir? I think everybody, Kashmiri Muslims, also need to open up to the possibilities, to what is it that they can do in whatever way they can, because people are all different. They have their different strengths. What can they do to bring hope and possibility to the next generation within Kashmir, and also to make a contribution to the world culture and civilization? We are not alone anymore, because what Kashmir did is what the entire world is interested in many sectors of the world, in scientific sectors and so on. So why can't Kashmir get into that? Why can't Kashmir create great medical centers, hospitals and other things? I think the possibilities are endless. All that is needed is for the Kashmiri population right now to embrace it. And I'm very disappointed how the narratives, both from Delhi and certainly from New York and London, have missed out on these astonishingly positive and optimistic parts of the Kashmiri story.
Absolutely. So we have a lot of audience questions coming in. Do you mind if we just turn to some brief lightning responses to those questions before we close?
Sure.
So one of the questions that's coming in is, we've talked a lot about the positive aspects of the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A in terms of redressing civil rights issues. Are there any negative aspects or potential fallouts of this move that we should be aware of?
I don't see any negatives at all. What I see is that apart from any mischief that Pakistan might want to do, I believe the Prime Minister has left open the possibility that Jammu and Kashmir could still be made into a regular state in a short period of time. And I have no doubt that that will happen. So I don't see any negatives at all.
One of the other things that you had mentioned earlier was that Kashmiri Pandits or Kashmiri Hindus were the only group that was singled out as not having special protections or minority special privileges. So there's this narrative often that Kashmiri Pandits were a privileged group within the valley economically and socially. Is that true, or is that not correct?
That's not true. There were some Kashmiri Pandit families who owned land, but there were many other who were extremely poor, dirt poor. I don't want to talk about my own situation, which you can read about in my autobiography, The Circle of Memory. So you'll find out that indeed most Kashmiri Pandits were not prosperous at all, and they strived. And in fact, if you go back into history several hundred years ago, there have been many massacres, very sad part of in Kashmiri history. Many Kashmiri Hindus were cleansed out or massacred at many periods in time. And there was a time when only 11 families were left. This is late 1300s. And they come back, and they come back. Let me tell you why. Because they've been positive. In fact, ultimately, you have to reconcile. You cannot hold grudges. You cannot think only about the past, whatever it might have been. You have to be positive, and I think that's what needs to be done now and in the future as well.
All right, Professor Kak, are there any closing thoughts that you have for us? What are your hopes and aspirations for the state of Jammu and Kashmir moving forward?
Well, I would only say that I am very hopeful. I think Jammu and Kashmir can be a wonderful place. It can also be an example to the rest of India. And at a certain at a point in history where there are problems of Islamic extremism going from China to the Middle East to Philippines to Europe and even the West, I think Kashmir could show the way how to approach these issues in a more philosophical and reflective manner, like Kashmir had done for a long time. Let's call it the Sufi way. So why can't the Muslims across the world embrace the Sufi way and approach everybody else with love, which I'm sure most of them want to, but somehow the Islamic narrative itself has been hijacked by extremists. So there is need for that soothing salve to be applied to this narrative, and maybe it'll come from Kashmir. So I'm really, very hopeful.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kak, for joining us on this conversation. I know it went a little bit longer than we were both expecting, but our audience has been extremely engaged. And I do want to apologize to our audience members whose questions we weren't able to get to. There were so many of you who were so engaged with this conversation. It just goes to show how important an issue this is for the Hindu American community. And I just wanted to thank you, Dr. Kak, on behalf of all of us here at Hindu Students Council and our community viewers for taking the time to help declutter this issue for us.
Thank you, Prof. Really enjoyed being a part of this conversation.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Kak, and thank you all for watching here with us. Please be sure to stay tuned into Hindu Students Council for more conversations like this. And once again, thanking Dr. Kak, I'd like to sign off. Namaste, everybody.
Namaste.